A pleasant surprise at the end of a country road. A beautiful break in a modern metropolitan landscape. These are the Lord's Lighthouses, a tour of cherished historic church buildings. The landscape has changed drastically since the days of Robinson Springs Methodist Church's first pastor, Reverend Peyton Bibb, the brother of Alabama's first two governors. William Bibb served only 6 months in office before falling off his horse. He died several months later of excruciating pain from a bruised brain and kidney. His brother, Thomas Bibb, was appointed to complete the remaining year-and-a-half term as Alabama's second governor.
Our old church is one of the oldest churches in Alabama. It has been referred to as the mother church of our area. We decided to keep our church original as much as we can. We had good worship services and good preaching, and I started as a young boy, and very few Sundays have I missed coming to this old church in my lifetime. I've been coming here now, I think, about 74 years. And still a big part of my life. And I have enjoyed attending church up here.
The facade itself is a beautiful example of well-proportioned Greek Revival design, which was so popular in the 1830s and 40s all over America. The classical pilasters, of course, at the corners of the church emphasize the Greek Revival character, as does the well-proportioned entablature that runs across the front and down each side of the church, and the triangular pediment over the portico. The columns of the Robinson Springs Church, the fluted Doric columns, were probably hand-fashioned by slave carpenters. We don't know the builder of the actual carpenter or architect. I doubt the church had an architect. He was probably just a good country craftsman using the carpenter's handbooks that were available at the time. And the triple-hung windows that you see on either side were once they were typical of churches of that type, either double or triple hung sash windows with a lot of small panes. The portico is sheathed with flush boards. That's to inside, and that's to give it a little bit more dressy appearance, as if it were stone, rather than just the weatherboarding, the lapped weatherboarding that you see on the outside of the building.
Plans and pictures of Robinson Springs United Methodist Church are in Washington, D.C.'s Library of Congress, recording it as one of 3 perfect architectural types of churches in the South.
The Dietzville Methodist Church the land was donated by the Norfolk Ivy family in 1851. For the purpose of establishing a Methodist church.
Dietzville United Methodist Church was officially closed in the year 2001. Like many rural churches, the young folks left the community to find jobs, and church attendance dwindled down to just a few. Fortunately, a group of concerned residents formed the Dietzville Chapel and Cemetery Association to assume ownership and perpetual care of the property. Many churches are closed every year, some are abandoned. Dietzville Chapel is unique. Church buildings usually have double doors that open to accommodate a coffin and its pallbearers. Dietzville Chapel has a single wide door designed for the same purpose. Many historic homes also have this casket door or coffin door when a wake for a relative in the parlor was a rather common practice. If you thought innovations are limited to the modern age, Dietzville Chapel proves you wrong. In 1879, the architect placed the classrooms adjacent to one side of the sanctuary. The large doors collapsed to provide plenty of room for those big revival meetings, weddings, and funeral services. All large boats must turn back or dock at this point along the Coosa River. The Indian name Wetumpka explains why. Water rumbling, the rocky riverbed. Wetumpka missed becoming the capital of Alabama by just one vote. With over 30 residential and commercial historic buildings, Wetumpka's nostalgic atmosphere is attractive to movie producers. The movies The Grass Harp and The Big Fish were filmed in Wetumpka. In the old days, the rowdy folks were locked up in this place, the jail, called the Old Calaboose. The religious folks were lifted up in this place, Wetumpka Methodist Church.
Stylistically, it remains essentially classical in its form and in its treatment. It has the classical front with the triangular pediment and proportions, the use of the pilasters all around the front and down each side. But classicism was waning at this period, so you see some Victorian liberties creeping in. For instance, the pilasters are way too thick to be properly classical. And then you have brackets around the eaves, these curlicue brackets which are strictly Victorian in feel and quite a departure from the sober Greek revival of maybe 10 years earlier. The three-tiered wedding cake-like belfry atop the church, too, is unusually elaborate for Methodist churches in Alabama of that period. But probably the single most striking change and feature of this church is the fact that the auditorium or sanctuary is raised up off the ground. It's raised a full ground story. That was almost considered a Methodist feature when it first occurred in the 1830s and 40s. That is, raising the main worship area over a meeting space downstairs that accommodated lectures and Sunday school meetings and so forth. To me, one of the most interesting elements of the interior is the original array of pipes for the pipe organ. They retain their Victorian era painting. I have a hunch that when the church was first built, the walls were smooth plaster with decorative paintings, such as you see in the restored state Alabama state capitol today in Montgomery.
There is still a church bell in the steeple, which is not rung anymore, but I think the last time we rang it was in the bicentennial celebration of the nation. And they let me pull the bell rope, and I held on to it, and it pulled me way up off the floor when I went up. There used to be a habit of tolling the bell at the end of a funeral. When the corpse would leave the church, they would toll the bell one time for each year of the person's life. And when my great-grandfather, John Lancaster, was being buried, he was almost 100 years old. And by the time he got to the cemetery, up here, the old Wetumpka Cemetery, the bell had cracked from being rung so many times.
Like neo-Gothic style architecture everywhere, it is very informed architecture. It's architecture where they carefully try to imitate on an academic basis the true Gothic and especially English Gothic of the 14th and 15th and 16th centuries, the 16th century especially, the time of Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth. And it was architecture that not only was expensive to build, but you needed a very well-educated and informed architect to produce buildings of this quality and with this kind of convincing Gothic design. The most striking exterior roof feature is what they call a flèche. The flèche goes back to actually to France and the Low Countries. It was a very popular design in the medieval period. And to my knowledge, only 2 churches in Alabama went that far in their authentic Gothic detail at this period, and that was the Independent Presbyterian Church in Birmingham and the First Methodist in Montgomery, which are really the best examples in the state of this type of architecture.
But the interesting thing is that they have kept the same design all the way through. They didn't build a modern building next to a Gothic and so on. So they've kept the same theme all the way through, and that's been very good. But the beauty of this church is that the congregation was so firm on its plan to build this church that they did it in the hardest of times.
The hard times included the arrival of the Great Depression a year after the work began on the building. All Americans suffered economic hardship during the 1930s. The other setback involved the tragic death of a building inspector and major structural damage on November 29, 1932.
They were inspecting it for use on the following Sunday, and this was about Thursday. 2 men went into the big tunnel that goes all the way through, all the way around, and one of them's flashlight went out and he struck a match. Well, there was a gas leak in there, so there was an explosion.
After the explosion, I was so amazed that they were able to rebuild the facility and open on Thanksgiving Day in 1933 for services.
A wide central aisle accommodates various liturgical processions. The pulpit and lectern are located on either side of the chancel area.
The carved reredos, or carved backdrop, or reredos as it's called, behind the altar is one of the finest of its type anywhere in Alabama, probably in the southeast. A very handsome piece of carving with Christ figure in the center behind the ornate altar cross. The main ceiling of the church is in itself almost a work of art in the handsome Gothic trusses, series of them that roof the nave, and then the very ornamental acoustical tile ceiling that is that actually resembles the ornamental painting that would have been found in a medieval church. The organ pipes with the antiphonal organ, that is an organ at the back of the church to give, you might say, surround sound to the music, is also a feature that would have been found in many fine medieval chapels and churches. early Methodist architecture, that is architecture of the mid-1700s when Methodism was getting off the ground, was very, very simple for a number of reasons. In the first place, the people called Methodists were mostly made up of the humble, working class, the poor. Methodism's mission, when it started out in England in the mid-1700s, was especially to the poor and the humble in society, although it was a movement within the larger established Anglican Church. Its particular focus was to reach the unchurched masses. And John Wesley, though he remained a loyal priest or clergyman in the Church of England all of his life, felt that Methodism's peculiar reason for existence was to reach the hearts and the minds of the masses. And it was a tenet of faith that they deliberately lived their lives simply. They did not ornament themselves with a lot of jewelry and rouge and so forth, that they lived apart from the world. And their church buildings likewise reflected that philosophy. They were to be simple, just as a Methodist in his life and his attire was to live simply. But as with all movements, that began to change and be modified. And so even by the early 1800s, let's say by the 1820s and 30s, Methodist individual congregations were beginning to aspire toward buildings other than the simple meeting houses that they had originally erected. Bishop Francis Asbury, who is more than any other figure the person credited with spreading Methodism far and wide in early America, complained that some Methodist churches even wanted horror belfries or steeples on their meeting houses, which he considered to be a little bit beyond the pale. Why not use that money for some useful purpose other than just a whimsical belfry for a steeple? And in fact, the first steeple we have record of on a Methodist church was around 1812 or 1814 in Lynn, Massachusetts, and Bishop Asbury commented pointedly on it. By the mid-1850s, though, Methodism was joining the mainstream architecturally, and especially after the Civil War, there was a deliberate movement in Methodism to build churches that made a statement as to how powerful Methodism had become within the American society as a whole. The Gothic architecture, which had already been embraced by the Presbyterians and Episcopalians, and to some extent even the Baptists, was a style that you don't see much in Methodism at all until the 1850s, not only because it had really not become super popular until that time anywhere, but also, again, because Methodism was shunning to frivolous or ornamented architecture. That's why the Greek Revival appealed to a lot of Methodists, because it was pleasant and pretty to look at, but at the same time it was not overly ornamental. Whereas the Gothic architecture, which was then beginning to become fashionable again, was a little bit more ornamented. But after the Civil War, there was a real push for Methodists to build these large, imposing Gothic urban sanctuaries, and part of that was because they were really beginning to feel the competition from other denominations. As the country became wealthier and more materialistic, other denominations were building these big sanctuaries to make statements as to how powerful they were in earthly terms and how affluent many of them had become. And Bishop Matthew Simpson, who was probably the best-known Methodist bishop of the 1860s and 70s, was the minister for President Grant and was very prominent spokesman for Methodist ideas, actually gave an address at a National Methodist Convention in which he urged that if Methodism was to stay abreast of the growth of other denominations, it had to upgrade its architecture and build more imposing churches. exterior of the Dexter Avenue Church is a great example of typical Methodist urban architecture of the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s period. The style, original style, was basically Romanesque, and that is characterized by heavy arched openings, arched windows, arched doors that are usually emphasized by very prominent stone trim. Another thing that the Victorians were very fond of, and which is well expressed on the exterior of the Dexter Avenue Church, was the mixing and matching of different kinds of colors and materials. So you have terracotta ornamentation around the eaves and embellishing the exterior. You have stone, you have brickwork, and it's in different patterns and different colors and different textures.
Well, the church construction was started in the 1890s, I think, and it was in the 1900s before they ever really moved into the sanctuary. And the big holdup was getting a roof on, and I think that was what the last money was raised for. And I've forgotten the name of the preacher, but he was a very eloquent preacher apparently, because the story was, and Mr. Romer, who was a charter member of the church, wrote this story down, and it's in a little publication of the history of Montgomery churches. But he said that the people were so moved that they gave jewelry for the into the offering plate when they had not enough money to give, that people parted with their watches and rings for the construction of the roof. And at that time, a song was written called "The Roof is Going On."
Decorative winding staircases are located in the tower foyers of Dexter Avenue United Methodist Church. The ornate railing and banisters appear to be hand-carved, but architectural historian Bob Gamble says that's not the case for this staircase.
These kinds of ornamental stair railings, newel posts, and trim were mass-produced by the trainload in the Victorian period at steam mills, especially in the Midwest, places like Chicago and Cincinnati, and also up east. And you could actually mail order a complete stair rail for your church or house from one of these big manufacturers.
The sanctuary was remodeled in the 1950s. Much of its Victorian-era characteristics are gone. However, the organ remains with attractive Victorian stencil designs on the pipes. Bob Gamble with the Alabama Historical Commission believes the best feature of the Dexter Avenue United Methodist Church's sanctuary has to be the collection of Victorian stained glass.
And this is a time when figures were beginning to creep into stained glass. Up until that period, again, in evangelical Protestant denominations like the Methodist Church especially, there had been a certain prejudice against using human figures in stained glass. It was considered idolatry and a little bit too Roman Catholic. But by the 1890s, early 1900s, that prejudice had kind of abated. And so you see figures like Christ, the shepherd of the sheep, and other symbols in the stained glass.
The Alabama West Florida Conference of the United Methodist Church has a depository of archives and historical materials located on the Huntington College campus. Mary Ann Pickard helps maintain historical records, and she preserves many interesting artifacts related to church history.
We have one ordination certificate signed with Bishop Asbury's signature of Jonathan Byrd, who, though he's not of this conference, it is an early ordination certificate dating back to the 3rd of April, 1791. I do not know where this circuit rider suit came from, but if you notice, it's it is the suit of a poor circuit rider, but you can tell by the patches in the pants. But it was very nice to see something really the original suit, and just to imagine what this circuit rider had to live through as a pioneer in Alabama.
Looking for the model church? The Conference Archives has this well-crafted model of the Sylvan Grove Methodist Church. Paul Kennedy spent over 280 hours constructing this 1-inch to 1-foot replica of his beloved home church. The church has corncob head parishioners, a preacher at the pulpit, little lanterns on the walls, and 24 hand-carved pews. Kennedy built this model in 1948. The original church was torn down to make room for a new church building.